I think it'll be smart if I just jump right into this with no hesitation. And with that out of the way, the Hall of Fame class of 1965 consisted of only one guy from the Veterans Committee, and that was a 19th century pitcher named Pud Galvin. His career took place from 1879 to 92, and it was always one of the most durable arms and averaged almost 300 innings per season. Galvin was a 20-game winner 10 times, led the NL in shutouts twice, and has the second most complete games thrown with 639. He became the first 300-game winner in 1888, and he retired 4 years later with 361 wins, a 2.85 ERA, and was always one of the most reliable pitchers in the game, even though he played during a time where pitchers started every other game. This next class may have been small, as it featured only 2 guys, but those selected had some of the biggest impacts on the game ever. From the writers' ballots came Ted freakin' Williams, and from the Veterans Committee came manager Casey Stengel. Whenever people have talks about who the greatest hitter in history is, some might say Ruth, Cobb, Mantle, or DiMaggio, and rightfully so, but there's no denying that Ted Williams left his mark as one of the most influential hitters in baseball history. As a Red Sox lifer, Williams played for over 2 decades, with 5 years off from serving in the Marines, and he got 93.4% support from the writers in 1966. To quickly sum up the Splendid Splinter's greatness, there was only one non-military season in his career where he wasn't named an All-Star, and that was his rookie season in 1939, even though he hit .327 that season with 145 RBI. 2 years later, he recorded one of the most famous seasons in history, hitting .406 with a 1,287 OPS, and what's crazier is that he didn't even win AL MVP that year. The 2 MVP awards he won came after serving in the Marines during World War II, and he only played in 6 games in 1952 before going back to serve in the Korean War. After coming back, he hit .337 for the last 7 seasons of his career before walking away from the game after the 1960 season. Teddy finished his career with a laundry list of stats and accolades, including a .344 career average, 521 home runs, 1,839 RBI, an MLB record career .482 on-base percentage, 6 AL batting titles, 2 AL MVP awards, and 19 AL All-Star selections. In the end, it seems like he always wanted to be known as the greatest hitter ever, and if he never served in the military, there's a good chance we'd be having conversations today about him being easily the greatest to do it in the batter's box. Regardless of his military service, he's been cemented in history as the greatest Red Sox ever and the greatest left fielder the game has ever seen. With all that being said about Ted, the other inductee from the 1966 class is Casey Stengel, one of the game's all-time great managers who spent most of his time with the Yankees. After doing his time as a player, he first spent about a decade managing the Dodgers and Braves, but after little success with either team, he spent time as a minor league manager before getting hired by the Yankees for the 1949 season. His first 5 years there literally couldn't have gone better, as he led the Yankees to 5 consecutive World Series championships from 1949 to 53, with 2 more being won in 1956 and 58. Not only did he always have so much talent around him, but he was always one of the smartest and most tactical managers ever, often platooning his players depending on the situation. Stengel was let go by the Yankees after losing the 1960 World Series and was then hired by the brand new expansion New York Mets in 1962. That's right, he was the manager of the historically awful 1962 Mets team that went 40-120, and they never really improved that much under him, so I don't blame him for leaving in the middle of the 1965 season. Anyway, he finished with 1,905 wins, along with a record 7 World Series victories, and he will be remembered as not only one of the best managers ever, but also as having one of the wittiest and most popular personalities that the game has ever seen. The class of 1967 technically did increase from the previous year, but it was still a relatively small class, as the writers elected Red Ruffing from a runoff ballot, and the Veterans Committee elected Branch Rickey and Lloyd Waner, which if I remember correctly are 2 guys that I've mentioned before in my previous videos. But before I get to them, I want to talk about Red Ruffing, the lone BBWAA electee this year who was yet another all-time great Yankee back in the 1930s and 40s. Ruffing received 86.9% support from the writers on the runoff ballot, and his path to the Hall seemed tough not only when he lost 4 toes on his left foot when he was young, but also when he came up with the Red Sox in the mid-1920s and put up 5 seasons of double-digit losses there. A mid-season trade to the Yankees was the best thing that could have happened to him, and he won at least 20 games in 4 seasons in the Bronx. He became known as one of the best workhorses of his time and was a big contributor to 6 World Series titles with the Yankees, putting up a career .252 ERA in the playoffs. Ruffing was also another guy who served in the military in the middle of his career and played for 3 more years after the war before retiring. Ruffing finished his career with 273 wins, a 3.8 ERA, and was described by longtime Yankee catcher Bill Dickey as, quote, "the best pitcher I ever caught." The first of 2 Veterans Committee inductees this year was Branch Rickey, who was a guy who had a ginormous impact on baseball, even though he had a very mediocre playing career. After said playing career, he then attended law school and ended up back in the game as a manager and executive in 1914. His first big accomplishment as an executive was the creation of what we now call the minor league farm system, which was created as a way for young players to get prepared to eventually play in the bigs. This creation, which he invented while with the Cardinals, helped St. Louis develop so much homegrown talent that would result in 3 World Series wins over a 13-year span. Rickey was then hired as GM of the Dodgers in 1943, and when going over there, he popularized teams using helmets, batting cages, pitching machines, and analytics as a way to prepare for games. But as you all know, that was far from the most important thing he did as Dodgers GM. He was the guy that signed Jackie Robinson to the Dodgers in 1947, shattering baseball's color barrier in doing so. As I said in my last video, the main reason Rickey signed Jackie was that he believed he was the guy that would refuse to fight back against any criticism that he heard and would use it instead to further his own cause. Needless to say, Branch Rickey was one of the most important men to serve as a baseball executive, and he's been remembered as one of the biggest modern-era pioneers of the game. The other VC inductee in 1967 was Lloyd Waner, who spent so many years in Pittsburgh figuratively and literally playing little brother to Paul Waner. Lloyd started in the Steel City when he was 21 and made an immediate impact, as he recorded at least 200 hits in 4 of his first 5 seasons. He rarely ever struck out and was always one of the best defensive center fielders of his time, making a very formidable duo of him and the elder Paul. Lloyd left the Pirates in the middle of the 1941 season and bounced around a few teams before retiring with Pittsburgh after 1945. Little Poison, as he was nicknamed, finished with a .316 average, 2,459 hits, 1,201 runs scored, and still holds the NL record for most hits by a rookie with 223. Just like the previous class, 1968 featured 1 guy elected from the BBWAA and 2 guys elected by the Veterans Committee. The BBWAA guy was Joe Medwick, and the 2 VC electees were Kiki Cuyler and Goose Goslin. The longtime St. Louis Cardinal Joe Medwick was the only BBWAA electee this year, and he received 84.8% of votes from the writers. The left fielder burst onto the scene at 20 years old and made his first All-Star team 2 years later, which was the first of 10 he'd get named to. That was also the same year he led the Cardinals to a World Series victory over the Tigers. His only MVP award was won in 1937 when he hit .374, all while winning the NL Triple Crown. Ducky, as he was also known, was traded to the Dodgers during 1940, and he'd continue to do a lot of work there as a run producer and a solid defensive outfielder. He'd then bounce around a few teams for the next few years before returning to St. Louis in 1947 and retiring the next year. Medwick wrapped up his career with a .324 mark, 1,383 RBI, 540 doubles, and was known as a guy who was never afraid to swing at anything. The next guy is Kiki Cuyler, a right fielder who spent the bulk of his playing career with the Pirates and Cubs during the 1920s and 30s. He first got full playing time with Pittsburgh in 1924 when he hit .354 with 85 RBI, and he played a big role in the Pirates' World Series victory the next year. After missing most of the 1920 season because of contract issues, he was traded to the Cubs and would continue to hit just as well as ever in the Windy City. Cuyler would spend the last few years with the Reds and Dodgers before calling it quits, and he finished with a .321 average, 2,299 hits, and he definitely has one of the most memorable names of anyone that's in the Hall of Fame. Goose Goslin is the other VC inductee from the 1968 class, and he was a longtime Washington senator that always manned left field very well. While he was known as a really quirky and awkward dude, he was always happiest when he got to play ball, as he had 11 seasons of hitting 300 or better and driving in 100 or more runs, and that included an AL batting title in 1928. He also won a World Series with the Senators in 1924 and did so again with the Detroit Tigers in 1935. Goose called it a career after 1938 with a .316 average, 2,735 hits, 1,612 RBI, and always seemed to carry that happy-go-lucky attitude that stuck with him all throughout his life. To conclude what was one of the craziest decades in American history, 4 new electees were voted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1969. The baseball writers voted in Stan Musial and Roy Campanella, 2 of the best to ever do it at their positions, and the Veterans Committee voted in Stan Coveleski and Waite Hoyt, who were 2 amazing pitchers when they were in their prime. Here stands baseball's perfect warrior. Here stands baseball's perfect knight. Those were the words that former Commissioner Ford Frick once said about Stan Musial, the greatest St. Louis Cardinal who was also one of the greatest left fielders the game ever saw. He received 93.2% of votes from the writers in 1969, and he made his impact on the Cardinals straight from the word go. In just his second full season in 1943, Stan the Man won NL MVP after hitting .357 with 220 hits and 48 doubles. From then on until his retirement in 1963, he could be named an All-Star in every season he played in, which totaled up to 24 NL All-Star selections. And keep in mind that multiple All-Star games were held in some seasons, which brought his total up a bit. After serving in the military in 1945, he came back and only won his second MVP award, but the best individual season of his career came in 1948, when he came 1 home run shy of winning the NL Triple Crown en route to his 3rd and final MVP campaign. His unique style of hitting would keep him successful into his 40s, where he would always stand in a corkscrew stance and slap the ball the opposite way. That kept him around until he was 42, and he called it a career after 1963 with so many things to talk about. These include 24 All-Star appearances, 3 NL MVPs, 3 World Series titles, and 7 NL batting titles. The stats speak for themselves, as he finished at a .331 average, 3,630 hits, 1,951 RBI, and 725 doubles. Lots of comparisons were made back then between Musial and Ted Williams, and though the 2 were amazing individual players, everyone could agree that Musial was the more likable human being, and everyone loved to be around Stan the Man. When we talk about people in sports history who went through really unfortunate times, Roy Campanella should really be brought up more often because he started in MLB so late only because of his skin color, and his career ended early just because of a car accident. Campy was a catcher who spent his decade-long MLB career with the Dodgers from 1948 to 57 and got 79.4% support from the writers. He started in pro baseball in the Negro Leagues when he was only 15, and eventually worked his way into becoming one of the top players in the league soon after. Roy was then signed by the Dodgers in 1946, made his debut 2 years later, and became their full-time catcher in 1949. He turned into one of the best hitting catchers in baseball, winning 3 MVP awards in a 5-year period and setting the then record for most RBI in a season by a catcher with 142. His last MVP was won the same year he helped the Dodgers win the World Series, too. Although his production had been falling off by then, Campanella still had a little bit left in the tank, but tragically before the 1958 season started, he was involved in a car accident that left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. His MLB career that he waited so long for came to a sudden end just like that. In the end, his pro baseball career finished with a .283 average, 3 NL MVP awards, a World Series title, and has been known as both an amazing offensive and defensive catcher whose career has been filled with so many what-ifs. The first of 2 VC inductees in '69 was Stan Coveleski, a pitcher who spent his best days with the Indians over 100 years ago. He grew up in a relatively poor family and spent his youth working in the coal mines, but amazingly still found time to practice baseball. Stan eventually made his big league debut with the Athletics in 1912, but stuck around for good with Cleveland in 1916. While with the Indians, he recorded an ERA under 3 in 5 seasons and won at least 20 games 4 times. In 1920, he won all 3 of his starts with a .67 ERA in the World Series to help the Indians win the Fall Classic. Coveleski was then traded to the Senators in 1925, where he'd continue to pitch well before signing with the Yankees in 1928. He retired after then, and finished with 215 wins, a .289 ERA, and was known as a guy who never showed any emotion and always went about his business when on the mound. Waite Hoyt is the final inductee I'll be talking about from the 1960s, who spent a decade of his career with the Yankees. He got started in the majors when he was only 18, and I thought the Red Sox learned from their past mistake to not trade anyone to the Yankees, but they did it anyway. And Hoyt became best remembered as the ace of the 1927 Yankees, often said to be the greatest baseball team ever assembled. Hoyt helped the Bronx Bombers win 3 World Series titles and would bounce around with many different teams after leaving the Yankees before retiring in 1938. After his playing career, he served as the Reds' play-by-play announcer for 24 years, and once improvised a whole thing about Babe Ruth for 2 hours shortly after it was announced that the Great Bambino had died. As for what he did as a player, Hoyt finished with 237 wins, a .359 ERA, and overall lived a baseball life that so many people in the sport could only ever dream of.